Symposium 1. As we went into Symposium 1, we weren't sure as the planners for that group as to whether we had an idea out there that flood risk was more than probability times consequences. But what we found across the entire group that was there, a very strong understanding that if we limit flood risk simply to a very simple definition of public safety, we've missed the opportunity that flood risk presents, and that's what we need to move forward. Okay, outcomes. What I'm going to be presenting next would be what were some of the findings from the forum and what are some of the recommendations. And the first was, how do we benchmark and monitor our progress towards achieving this overarching vision being flood risk management? First is, the forum experts agreed that a suite of indicators is needed. It's not one single factor, but a suite of indicators we should be considering, and the indicators could be grouped. Now, one of the exercises we did at the forum is rather than have our breakout sessions go in and start to fill out butcher paper and things like that, we started to use the notion of developing a flood risk dashboard. And what the concept essentially was is that when you drive your car and you're looking at the performance of your car, you have a number of indicators that are out there that tell you how you're performing. You perhaps have a central one that many of us look at, the speedometer, that maybe guides more of your actions, but you have other indicators on the dashboard that help understand in terms of your overall performance. And that's what the forum members replicated in 3 different groups, was the notion of these dashboards, which I believe was not only a useful exercise in terms of getting people to talk and discuss about what's important, but perhaps is an insight in terms of how we should be managing flood risk in the future, moving again towards a suite of indicators that help address where we're going with flood risk management. How do we get the public and decision makers to act in a more risk-aware and resource-sensitive manner? Well, there were a number of findings, but what this really came down to was, how do we move the dial of those dashboards? What are the things that are going to make a difference to be able to manage flood risk? You know, some of these things could be incentives for avoiding floodplain in coastal areas. Another one was a discussion of revival of programs that foster locally driven processes for change, which I think was much in keeping in terms of what Dennis coined monkey see, monkey do. If you go back over the history of what we've done in the past, programs such as Project Impact or similar things along that line, what it was doing was putting good examples in the communities to not only train leaders, but individuals in those communities in terms of actions they could take. And perhaps those are the things we can do to help move that part of the dial. What do we need to adjust in policy and programs to meet the overarching vision and overcome other challenges? Well, first off, we need to achieve consensus on the term flood risk. Even at the conclusion of the forum, we were wandering and moving towards, I think, a consensus-based definition, but it's still open for discussion. It includes that risk management must embrace the values of the natural resources, and we need to make sure that we're not being stuck on communicating messages in inappropriate ways in the future. Finally, the group came forward with what are the knowledge gaps we need to fill. And I've just selected a handful of the knowledge gaps we need to fill for examples, but this would be some of the follow-up research that we would encourage the agency, that the foundation itself perhaps would try and fund, that universities and others should be looking for in terms of things we need to be doing for the future. First is that we should have an inventory of floodplain resources and development of the floodplain. I mean, I guess it's rather puzzling to a lot of us when we go back and say that it's only been the last few years where we've had the priority and the funding to be able to identify where our levees are. But at this point in time, we still do not have sufficient knowledge in terms of where our development and resources really lie. And that is a fundamental step in terms of if we're going to embrace a flood risk management strategy, well, we need to understand what the universe is. We need to understand what it is about successful community-based approaches that make them work. Dennis has cracked the door in terms of some of that research on individuals, but how does that apply to community decision-making? That's a new frontier that we need to expand into. We need to understand what motivates people to purchase property where they do. It's a matter of that what we're finding is that there's perhaps some anecdotal evidence that would suggest why people go where they want to try and go, but we need to research and understand what's pushing them that direction. We need to understand risk avoidance better. Can we get people to change their behaviors? We need to assess the full cost of local decisions, and we need to identify some of the future unknowns, including anticipated impacts of climate change. From the forum itself, we also move forward an action agenda. And this action agenda would cover a number of different areas. In fact, we had 9 items on the action agenda itself. For purposes of time this morning, I'll just present 4. First, the forum suggested that 1, the newly adopted or newly revived Federal Interagency Task Force adopt a common definition for comprehensive flood risk management as part of an update to the UNP, the Unified National Program for Floodplain Management. There's a lot in that recommendation, and there are probably some folks in the room that are wondering what this is all about. There are other folks in the room that are sitting on this task force. And what the forum was suggesting is that as we pull together and we revive this group of interagency experts talking and debating techniques, the best thing they could do is focus some time in terms of looking at this definition of flood risk, making sure we have consensus, and then benchmark that within a publication such as the Unified National Program for Floodplain Management. It would be very helpful in terms of getting flood risk management off on a cohesive and smart first step. The forum suggested that all people doing training and messaging need to be on the same page. Again, drawing directly from the work of Dennis and his colleagues, it's a matter of that we need to be looking at multiple messages from multiple locations. The messages need to be about the issue, not about the agencies or the organizations. So again, key findings. We need to develop local indicators of progress in floodplain management. The forum itself very much was looking at flood risk management from a national perspective, and it was by design. But during the event, some individuals were saying, you know, what drives us at the local level may be somewhat different than what drives you at the national level. Well, that opens up 2 opportunities and a concern. The first opportunity is, well, let's figure out what we should be doing that would drive this decision making at the local level. But more important, do we need to determine if there are disconnects between the drivers at the local level versus what we think is important at the national level? The foundation, as part of our work plan for the upcoming year, is exploring the notion of trying to replicate in some fashion within 2 local locations a subset of this forum activity that could be tailored to local activities. And so hopefully over the course of the next year or 2, we can report back more on those findings. And finally, this forum suggested that the incentives and disincentives inherent in existing federal programs be assessed to determine what supports or undermines comprehensive flood risk management. Now, this is a very broad effort. It's something that actually the foundation began to support and fund about 2 to 3 years ago in what we're calling the No Adverse Impact Matrix. But this is a technique that could be applied and go broader into other programs. Jeannie Christie with the Association of State Wetland Managers pointed out very early on that if you take a look at what the success was in terms of the no net loss approach to wetland management, the 2 things they did was they had a knowledge of where the wetlands were, but more important is they went in there to understand how certain programs were impacting the wetlands. I think it's a good lesson learned, and it's one we can bring forward into the flood risk management and floodplain management arena. So those were the conclusions in terms of what we discovered, but I would be remiss in terms of not recognizing here on the screen the 29 and more volunteers that helped make this happen. It was a large group effort, but that's part of what the foundation does. It's a collaborative effort of bringing folks in. You'll have a chance to see many of the names. I think many of the people who were participants in helping put this together at the conference. But also, we would be remiss to not thank the forum participants themselves. We went in again and handpicked 100 experts to come in and sit down that represent a broad variety of expertise from federal agencies, non-government organizations, state, local governments, private sector. And that's really what helped us to begin to boil down the results that we brought forth today. The next steps that we'll be doing as a foundation is we're in the process this summer of preparing our finalized report and coming forth with recommendations. And as part of that, we'll begin to expand and begin to implement the other the total of 9 action items that I had previously discussed. So with that, I thank you. And as you move forward into the conference today and over the next few days, I would urge you and encourage you to think about what the findings were, what the thoughts were that came out of the forum, and think about how they inform your discussions at this conference. Thank you.